Officer James Miller let out a tired sigh as he drove his patrol car down the quiet streets of Pine Grove, a small suburban neighborhood that rarely saw any action after sunset. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalks, and the autumn wind rustled through the trees, creating an eerie atmosphere that even a seasoned cop like James couldn't ignore. It was just another routine night patrol, or so he thought, until he noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. A small, dark figure seemed to be following his car from a distance. James slowed down, thinking it might be a stray cat or dog, but when he looked again, the shadow disappeared into the darkness between two houses. Must be seeing things, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. 12 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, but tonight he blamed his imagination on the 3 cups of coffee he'd consumed during his shift. The next evening, James was walking his beat when that same uneasy feeling crept up his spine. He turned around quickly, catching a glimpse of movement behind a parked car. This time, he was sure it wasn't his imagination. The shadow was small, definitely human-shaped, and seemed to be deliberately tracking his movements. James reached for his flashlight and shone it in the direction of the parked car, but whoever or whatever was there had already vanished. He spent the next hour searching the area but found nothing out of the ordinary. As the week progressed, the mysterious shadow became a regular presence during James's night patrols. Sometimes it would appear behind trees, other times it would duck behind mailboxes or trash cans. Each time James tried to approach or investigate, the figure would disappear like smoke in the wind. The veteran officer began documenting these occurrences in his personal notebook. He noticed a pattern. The shadow only appeared between 10 p.m. and midnight, and always in the same 5-block radius of Pine Grove. What troubled him most was the size of the figure. If his estimations were correct, it couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall. One particularly quiet Thursday night, James was taking a short break on a park bench when he heard the soft scuffing of shoes against concrete. He remained still, pretending not to notice, but his trained ears picked up the sound of quiet breathing nearby. Whoever was following him wasn't very good at staying completely silent. James carefully reached for his flashlight, making sure his movements weren't too obvious. The breathing got closer, and he could sense the presence just a few feet behind the bench. In one swift motion, he turned and pointed his flashlight toward the source of the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing there, frozen in the beam of light, was a small boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He wore dirty jeans and a thin jacket that was far too light for the chilly autumn weather. His brown hair was messy and unwashed, and his face was smudged with dirt. But what struck James most were the boy's eyes, large, dark, and filled with a mixture of fear and determination. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then, just as James opened his mouth to speak, the boy turned and ran with surprising speed, disappearing into the darkness between two houses before the officer could even stand up. James's heart was racing. After all these nights of being followed, he finally had confirmation of what he'd been dealing with. Not a supernatural entity or a figment of his imagination, but a child. A child who, for some reason, had been stalking him during his patrols. As he sat back down on the bench, James's police training kicked in. Why would a young boy be out alone at this hour? Where were his parents? Was he homeless, runaway, or something worse? The fact that the child seemed to be specifically following him made the situation even more puzzling. That night, as James finished his shift and drove home, his mind couldn't shake the image of those haunting eyes. In all his years on the force, he never encountered anything quite like this. He knew one thing for certain. He needed to find this boy and figure out what was going on, before something terrible happened to the child in the dangerous nighttime streets. Little did Officer James Miller know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change both his life and the life of his mysterious young stalker forever. For the next several nights, Officer James Miller adjusted his patrol routine. Instead of driving his usual route, he began walking more frequently, hoping to create opportunities for the mysterious boy to approach him again. He carried an extra sandwich and a bottle of water in his jacket, just in case. The autumn nights were getting colder, and James couldn't stop worrying about the child being out in such weather. He'd reported the incident to his supervisor, but without more information, there wasn't much the department could do except keep an eye out for the boy. On Wednesday night, just as a light drizzle began to fall, James spotted the familiar shadow near Mrs. Peterson's garden. This time, instead of trying to approach directly, he sat down on a nearby curb and pulled out his sandwich. You could feel the boy's eyes watching him from behind the bushes. "You know," James said loudly enough to be heard but softly enough not to seem threatening, "I packed an extra sandwich today, turkey and cheese. It's not much, but it's fresh." He placed the wrapped sandwich on the ground beside him and scooted away slightly, creating a safe distance. For several minutes, nothing happened. The only sounds were the gentle patter of rain and distant traffic. Then, James heard it, the soft shuffling of small feet on wet pavement. From the corner of his eye, he saw the boy emerge from his hiding spot. The child moved like a scared animal, ready to bolt at the slightest sudden movement. In the street light, James could see him more clearly now. The boy wore the same dirty clothes as before, but now they were wet from the rain. His sneakers had holes in them, and his thin frame suggested he hadn't had a proper meal in quite some time. To James's surprise, the boy didn't grab the sandwich and run. Instead, he picked it up and sat down on the curb, maintaining about 10 feet of distance between them. He unwrapped the sandwich carefully, as if it were made of gold, and took small, measured bites. "I'm Officer Miller," James said gently, "but you can call me James. Would you like to tell me your name?" The boy swallowed his bite of sandwich and looked at James with those same intense eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy." "Nice to meet you, Tommy," James replied, fighting to keep his voice steady despite his racing heart. "How old are you?" "8," Tommy answered, taking another careful bite of the sandwich. James noticed how Tommy's hands trembled slightly, either from cold or fear, probably both. He slowly removed his jacket and held it out. "You must be freezing. Would you like to wear this?" Tommy stared at the jacket for a long moment before shaking his head. "Can't. Need to run if." He trailed off, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them. "If what, Tommy? Are you in danger? Someone hurting you?" The boy's face clouded over, and he quickly stuffed the remaining sandwich in his pocket. "I have to go," he said, starting to stand up. "Wait," James said softly, "will you at least take this?" He pulled out the water bottle and rolled it gently in Tommy's direction. Tommy snatched up the bottle and backed away, but didn't run immediately. He seemed to be struggling with something, wanting to say more but holding himself back. "I'll be here tomorrow night too," James offered. "Same time, same place, if you want another sandwich." For a brief moment, a flicker of hope crossed Tommy's face. Then, like a shadow dissolving in sunlight, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving James alone with his thoughts and growing concerns. Back at the station, James began searching through recent missing persons reports, looking for any children matching Tommy's description. Something about the boy's behavior suggested he wasn't just a runaway. There was real fear in those eyes, the kind that comes from experiencing something no child should ever have to face. As James drove home that night, the image of Tommy's trembling hands and cautious eyes haunted him. Whatever this boy's story was, he was determined to help him. But first, he needed to earn Tommy's trust, one sandwich at a time. The next few nights fell into a pattern. Tommy would appear at the same spot, and James would share his sandwich. Each time, the boy stayed a little longer, spoke a few more words, though he remained cautious and ready to flee at any moment. On this particular night, James noticed Tommy was limping slightly as he approached their usual meeting place. The officer's heart tightened when he saw blood seeping through the boy's worn-out sneaker. "You're hurt," James said, keeping his voice calm despite his concern. He reached for the first aid kit he'd started carrying in his patrol bag. "Will you let me help?" Tommy hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Pain flickered across his young face, and for the first time, his need for help seemed to outweigh his fear. "It's just a cut," Tommy mumbled, but he didn't run when James slowly moved closer with the first aid kit. Under the streetlight, James could see a deep gash on Tommy's foot where his shoe had worn through. As he carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound, he noticed old bruises on the boy's ankles and legs. "Tommy," James said gently, "I need to ask you something important. Where are you sleeping at night?" The boy's shoulders tensed, and he stared at the ground. After a long silence, he whispered, "The old storage units on Baker Street." James knew the place, a run-down storage facility at the edge of town. His heart sank thinking of this child spending cold nights there alone. "And your parents?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he fought them back. Dad died. He was like you, a police officer. Mom, his voice cracked. They took her away 6 months ago. Said she had bad things in her car. The pieces started falling into place in James's mind. He remembered a drug bust from earlier that year, a woman arrested with a significant amount of methamphetamine in her vehicle. But there had been no mention of a child in the report. Where were you when they took your mom? Hiding, Tommy admitted. Mom always told me to hide when police came, but then she didn't come back, and I was scared to come out. Nobody looked for me. James felt a wave of nausea hit him. A child had slipped through the cracks of the system, left to fend for himself while his mother went to jail. No wonder Tommy had been so afraid of police, and yet something had drawn him to follow James. Why did you start following me on my patrols? James asked softly. Tommy looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. You walk like my dad did. Same way of standing at corners, same way of checking windows. I just wanted to pretend for a little while that he was back. The confession hit James like a physical blow. He thought about this child, watching him from the shadows, trying to recapture some small connection to his lost father. Tommy, James said, choosing his words carefully, you can't keep living in that storage unit. It's not safe, and you deserve better than that. Will you let me help you? Really help you? Fear flashed across Tommy's face. Will they put me in jail like Mom? No, absolutely not, James assured him firmly. But there are people who can make sure you have a warm bed, good food, and proper care while we figure things out. I'll stay with you the whole time. You won't have to do this alone anymore. Tommy looked at James for a long moment, seeming to search for something in the officer's face. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he gave a small, tired nod. Can I? Tommy's voice was barely audible. Can I hold your hand? Dad used to let me hold his hand when I was scared. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He held out his hand, and Tommy's small, cold fingers slipped into his grasp. As they walked toward the patrol car together, James silently promised himself that this time, this child wouldn't fall through the cracks. This time, someone would fight for him. The night air was cold around them, but Tommy's hand was growing warmer in his. And for the first time in 6 months, the boy wasn't running away from a police officer. He was walking toward hope. At the police station, James watched as Tommy sat in the break room, hungrily devouring a proper meal from the vending machine while social services were being contacted. The boy's eyes kept darting to the doors and windows, but he seemed to relax slightly whenever James gave him a reassuring smile. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran officer who specialized in child welfare cases, sat across from James at his desk, reviewing Tommy's mother's case file. Maria Stevens, Sarah read from the file, arrested 6 months ago for possession with intent to distribute. Currently serving time at State Correctional, but there's no mention of a child in any of these reports. She looked up at James with concern in her eyes. That's what bothers me, James replied, keeping his voice low to avoid alarming Tommy. How does an 8-year-old boy completely disappear from the system? No school records for the past year, no welfare checks, nothing. Sarah typed rapidly on her computer. According to this, Tommy's father, Officer David Stevens, died in the line of duty 2 years ago, shot during a robbery response. She paused, her expression softening. That explains why the boy was drawn to you, James. You probably remind him of his father. James nodded, watching Tommy carefully fold his empty sandwich wrapper into a tiny square. What happened after his father died? Maria Stevens received his pension and benefits, but things started going downhill fast. Multiple complaints from neighbors about suspicious activity at their house, signs of drug use, but every time social services tried to do a welfare check, nobody would answer the door. James felt a surge of frustration, and nobody thought to dig deeper, to make sure there wasn't a child in danger. The system's overloaded, James. You know that. Sarah sighed heavily. But this one's on us. We should have done more when we arrested his mother. A social worker named Mrs. Chen arrived shortly after, carrying a file and a gentle smile. She approached Tommy carefully, speaking to him in soft, kind tones. To James's relief, Tommy seemed to respond well to her, though he insisted that James stay in the room. As Mrs. Chen interviewed Tommy, the full story began to emerge. After his father's death, Tommy's mother had fallen into drug addiction, eventually becoming involved with local dealers. She had pulled Tommy out of school, claiming to homeschool him, but in reality, the boy had spent most of his time alone while his mother was either high or trying to get money for drugs. Tommy, Mrs. Chen asked gently, can you tell me about the storage unit where you were staying? Tommy's small fingers twisted in his shirt. Unit 23. The lock was broken. I found some old blankets inside, and nobody ever came there at night. During the day, I would walk around town, looking for food in dumpsters behind restaurants. James had to step out of the room for a moment, struggling to maintain his professional composure. The thought of this child scrounging for food while an entire community failed to notice his existence was almost unbearable. When he returned, Mrs. Chen was explaining to Tommy that he would need to stay at a children's emergency shelter temporarily while they located any potential relatives who could care for him. Officer Miller will still visit you, she assured Tommy, noting how the boy's eyes had immediately sought out James. We just need to make sure you're safe and properly cared for while we sort everything out. Can't I stay with Officer Miller? Tommy asked in a small voice that made James's heart ache. Mrs. Chen explained gently why that wasn't immediately possible, though she assured both Tommy and James that they could maintain contact through proper channels. As the night drew to a close, James watched the social worker lead Tommy toward her car. The boy looked back one last time, and James gave him a warm smile and a wave. I'll see you tomorrow, buddy, he called out. I promise. After they left, James sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. There had to be someone out there who could give Tommy the home he deserved. And until they found that person, he was determined to make sure this brave little boy never felt alone again. Tomorrow, he would begin searching for Tommy's relatives, but tonight, he simply said a quiet thank you to Officer David Stevens, wherever he was, for helping his son find the right person to trust. Over the next few days, James threw himself into investigating Tommy's family history. During his off-duty hours, he sat at his desk surrounded by files and old records, determined to find someone who could give Tommy a proper home. The children's shelter reported that Tommy was adjusting as well as could be expected. He was clean, properly fed, and had new clothes, but he asked about Officer Miller several times a day. True to his word, James visited every afternoon after his shift, usually bringing a puzzle or a book to share. On a particularly frustrating morning, as James rubbed his tired eyes after hours of searching, Detective Martinez rushed to his desk with an excited expression. I found something, she said, placing a worn file folder in front of him. I was digging through old paper records from before everything went digital. Tommy has a grandmother, his mother's mother, Elizabeth Cooper. James quickly opened the file, his heart racing. Where is she? Why wasn't she contacted when Maria was arrested? That's the complicated part, Sarah explained, pointing to an address on the yellowed paper. She moved to a small town in the neighboring state about 3 years ago, right after Officer Stevens died. Apparently, there was some kind of falling out with Maria when she started using drugs. James leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Do we have any current contact information? I got a possible address and phone number, Sarah replied, but James, there's something else you should see. She pulled out another document. Elizabeth Cooper has been trying to find Tommy for the past 6 months. She's filed multiple inquiries with social services in 3 different counties, but because Tommy wasn't officially in the system, the requests never connected with him. James finished, feeling a mix of hope and frustration. She's been looking for him this whole time? Not just looking, Sarah added. She's been fighting for him. Look at these letters she wrote to the court system, trying to find out if her grandson was with his mother when she was arrested. She never stopped searching. James immediately reached for his phone, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Wait, she said. We need to do this properly. Let me contact her through official channels first. We don't want to give her false hope if there are any complications. The next 24 hours were some of the longest of James's life. He visited Tommy at the shelter, noticing how the boy seemed both stronger and more vulnerable now that he was properly cared for. Tommy showed him a drawing he'd made of them both in police uniforms, and James had to swallow hard past the lump in his throat. Finally, late the next afternoon, Sarah called him into her office. On her speakerphone was a woman with a warm, gentle voice that cracked with emotion as she spoke. I never gave up hope of finding him, Elizabeth Cooper said, her words trembling. After David died, I watched Maria spiral downward, but she wouldn't accept help. When she cut off contact with me, I knew something terrible would happen. I've been searching for Tommy ever since I heard about her arrest. The woman's devotion to her grandson was clear in every word she spoke. She had already begun the process of applying for guardianship, had maintained a stable home and income, and had even kept all of Tommy's father's belongings that Maria had thrown away. "Mrs. Cooper," James said, "would you be willing to come and meet with Tommy? He's been through a lot, and we want to make sure the transition is as smooth as possible for him." "I can be there first thing tomorrow morning," she replied without hesitation. "I've kept his room ready for him all this time, hoping I'd find him." After the call ended, James sat quietly in Sarah's office, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Tommy wouldn't just have a home. You have a grandmother who had never stopped fighting for him, who had preserved his father's memory, and who could give him the stability and love he desperately needed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, James allowed himself to smile. Sometimes, even in the darkest stories, light found its way through the cracks, leading lost children home. The morning sun had barely risen when Elizabeth Cooper arrived at the police station. James observed the woman carefully. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair neatly styled and wearing a warm cardigan that suggested comfort and home. Her hands clutched her purse tightly, betraying her nervousness. "Officer Miller," she said, reaching out to shake his hand. "Thank you for finding my grandson. I've imagined this moment every day for 6 months." Before taking her to meet Tommy, James and Mrs. Chen sat down with Elizabeth to brief her on Tommy's condition and experiences. The grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she learned about the storage unit, the dumpster diving, and the lonely nights her grandson had endured. "I should have tried harder to find him," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I knew Maria was in trouble, but I never imagined she would let things get this bad." "You did everything you could legally do," Mrs. Chen assured her. "The important thing is that Tommy will have a chance at a fresh start now." When they arrived at the children's shelter, Tommy was sitting in the common room, solving a puzzle James had brought him the day before. He looked up as they entered, his eyes immediately finding James before noticing the unfamiliar woman beside him. Elizabeth stopped in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. "He looks so much like David," she said softly. Tommy stood up slowly, his posture tense and uncertain. James gave him an encouraging nod and said, "Tommy, there's someone very special here to see you. This is your grandmother, your mom's mom." Recognition flickered across Tommy's face. "Grandma Betty?" he asked hesitantly. "From the yellow house with the cookie jar?" Elizabeth let out a small sob of joy. "Yes, sweetheart. You remember. You used to love those chocolate chip cookies we would bake together when you were little." Tommy took a small step forward, then another. "Dad used to take me there on Sundays," he said, his voice growing stronger with each memory. "You had a tire swing in the backyard." "It's still there," Elizabeth said gently. "I've kept it ready, hoping you would come back to use it again." Something in Tommy's expression changed, a mixture of hope and longing that made him look his age for the first time since James had met him. "You wanted me?" he asked in a small voice. Elizabeth knelt down to his level, tears flowing freely now. "I've always wanted you, Tommy. I've been searching for you ever since your mom went away. I never stopped looking." Tommy glanced at James, seeking reassurance. James nodded encouragingly. "Your grandmother has a home ready for you, buddy. She's kept all your dad's things, too." "Dad's things?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Mom threw everything away." "Not everything," Elizabeth said. "I saved his police badge, his favorite books, and all the pictures. I even have the Father's Day cards you made him. Would you like to see them?" Tommy took another step forward, then suddenly ran into his grandmother's arms. Elizabeth wrapped him in a tight embrace, both of them crying now. James and Mrs. Chen quietly stepped back, giving them space for their reunion. As they watched grandmother and grandson begin to rebuild their connection, Mrs. Chen whispered to James, "This is why we do this job. For moments like these." James nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. He watched as Tommy showed his grandmother the puzzle he'd been working on, as Elizabeth gently stroked his hair as they began the delicate process of becoming family again. Later, as Elizabeth filled out temporary custody paperwork, Tommy came to stand beside James. "Will you still visit me?" he asked anxiously. "At Grandma's house?" James knelt down to look Tommy in the eye. As often as I can, buddy. And you know what? Your grandmother lives just a few blocks from where your dad used to patrol. I bet he watched over that neighborhood just like I watch over this one. Tommy smiled, a real, full smile that transformed his whole face. Maybe one day I can be a police officer too, like you and Dad. I bet you'll be the best, James replied, knowing that whatever path Tommy chose, he would no longer have to walk it alone. 2 months had passed since Tommy moved in with his grandmother. The transformation in the boy was remarkable. His thin frame had filled out with proper meals, and the constant fear in his eyes had been replaced by a growing confidence. James kept his promise to visit regularly. Every Sunday afternoon, he would pull up to Elizabeth's yellow house in his patrol car, and Tommy would race out to greet him, usually with a new story to tell or achievement to share. On this particular Sunday, James arrived to find Tommy sitting on the front porch steps, holding something in his hands. As James approached, he saw it was his father's old police badge, carefully preserved in a glass case. Grandma found more of Dad's things in the attic, Tommy explained, his fingers tracing the badge's outline through the glass. She says I can keep this in my room now. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. He's been doing so well, Officer Miller. The therapist says his progress is remarkable. She smiled warmly at her grandson. Why don't you show James your report card? Tommy jumped up and ran inside, returning moments later with a piece of paper. James took it, noting the string of beads and even a few A's. This is fantastic, buddy. You worked really hard. The teachers at my new school helped me catch up, Tommy said proudly. And Grandma helps me with homework every night. Elizabeth had enrolled Tommy in a local elementary school, where understanding teachers worked to bridge the educational gaps from his year of absence. The boy's natural intelligence, combined with his determination to succeed, had helped him adapt quickly. There's something else, Elizabeth said, her eyes twinkling. Show him your special project, Tommy. Tommy disappeared into the house again, returning with a cardboard display board. On it were carefully arranged photographs and newspaper clippings about his father, Officer David Stevens. The center of the board featured a school essay titled My Hero. It's for the school's Father's Day exhibition, Tommy explained. I wrote about Dad and how he helped people, and, he glanced at James, about how other police officers help kids like me. James felt his throat tighten as he read the essay. Tommy had written about losing his father, about the dark times that followed, but also about finding hope again through another police officer who took the time to care. The school counselor says it's good for him to talk about these things, Elizabeth explained quietly, to process everything that happened and understand that it wasn't his fault. While Tommy went inside to get the cookies they baked, Elizabeth turned to James with tears in her eyes. I can never thank you enough for finding him. He's still healing, still has nightmares sometimes, but he's getting stronger every day. James watched through the window as Tommy carefully arranged cookies on a plate in the kitchen. He's an incredible kid. He survived things no child should have to face, but he never lost his capacity to trust and love. We've started visiting Maria in prison, Elizabeth added. Tommy was afraid at first, but it's helping him understand that his mother's problems weren't his fault. She's in a rehabilitation program now, finally getting the help she needs. Tommy returned with the cookies, and the three of them sat on the porch swing, listening to birds singing in the old maple tree. The tire swing swayed gently in the breeze, no longer waiting empty for a lost child, but regularly used by a boy who was finding his way home. Officer Miller, Tommy said between bites of cookie. Next career day at school, would you come with me? I know Dad can't be there, but maybe you could help me tell his story. James looked at this brave young boy who had gone from stalking him in darkness to sitting beside him in the light, and felt honored to be part of his journey. I'd be proud to, Tommy, he replied. I'd be proud to. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, James realized that sometimes the most important police work wasn't about chasing criminals or solving crimes. Sometimes it was simply about being there when a lost child needed someone to trust, and helping that trust grow into hope. 1 year had passed since that fateful night when Officer James Miller first discovered his young stalker. The autumn air carried the same crispness, but everything else had changed. Tommy stood proudly in front of his school auditorium, wearing a carefully pressed suit that his grandmother had bought for the occasion. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and fellow students for the annual Community Heroes presentation, and Tommy was the final speaker. James sat in the front row beside Elizabeth, both of them beaming with pride. On Elizabeth's other side sat Maria, Tommy's mother, who had been granted a day's supervised release to attend. After completing her rehabilitation program and showing consistent progress, she was working to rebuild her relationship with her son, one supervised visit at a time. My story isn't just about heroes, Tommy began, his voice clear and confident. It's about second chances and the people who help us find our way when we're lost. He went on to tell this story, not the sanitized version, but the real one. He spoke about losing his father, about the dark times that followed, and about the nights he spent following a police officer who reminded him of what he'd lost. The audience sat in rapt attention as this young boy shared his journey from shadows to light. Officer Miller didn't just find me, Tommy continued, glancing at James. He showed me that sometimes help comes when we least expect it, and that it's okay to trust again. James felt Elizabeth squeeze his hand as Tommy spoke about his grandmother, about how she had never stopped searching for him, and how she had helped him rebuild his life piece by piece. He talked about his mother's struggle with addiction and her path to recovery, showing a maturity beyond his years and his understanding of human frailty and redemption. After the presentation, as people mingled in the school hallway, James noticed Tommy standing by his father's old police badge, which had been included in his display. The boy's fingers gently touched the glass case, a gesture James had seen many times over the past year. "You did great up there, buddy," James said, approaching him. "Your dad would have been very proud." Tommy looked up with a smile that held both sadness and hope. "I know. Grandma says he's watching over me. And now I have you too." Maria joined them, her eyes red from crying during the presentation. She was healthier now, clear-eyed and present in a way she hadn't been for years. "Tommy," she said softly, "what you said up there about forgiveness and second chances. Thank you." Elizabeth wrapped an arm around her grandson's shoulders. "Why don't we all go get some ice cream to celebrate? Officer Miller, you'll join us?" As they walked to the ice cream parlor, James reflected on how much had changed. Tommy was thriving in school, had made friends, and was even talking about joining the Junior Police Cadets program when he was old enough. Elizabeth had created the stable, loving home he needed, while supporting Maria's recovery and maintaining boundaries that kept Tommy safe. At the ice cream shop, Tommy dove into his sundae with the enthusiasm of any normal 9-year-old. Looking at him now, few would guess the hardships he had endured just a year ago. "Officer Miller," Tommy said between bites, "remember when you found me that night? Were you scared?" James smiled, remembering the mix of concern and relief he'd felt. "Not scared, buddy, just grateful I could help." "Well, I've decided something," Tommy announced. "When I grow up, I want to help kids like me. Maybe as a police officer like you and Dad, or maybe as a counselor like Mrs. Chen. But I want to help kids who are lost find their way home." The adults exchanged glances, moved by his words. Here was a child who had transformed his pain into purpose, his fear into hope. As the evening drew to a close, James watched Tommy walking hand in hand with his grandmother, his mother following close behind. The boy who once hid in shadows now walked confidently in the light, carrying with him the legacy of his father's courage, his grandmother's persistence, his mother's redemption, and the unexpected friendship of a police officer who had taken the time to look beyond the surface of things. Sometimes, James realized, the best endings are really just new beginnings in disguise.